Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes, and tonight on Greater Boston, Joe Biden's second State of the Union had more heckling than most. What does this say about the state of American politics and what the president will be able to get done in the second half of his term? Then later, Biden's renewed push to ban assault weapons. The president of Stand with Parkland and parent of one of the victims in the shooting joins me to discuss. While the overarching theme of President Joe Biden's second State of the Union address was unity and bipartisanship, the reality of the political animosity in Washington was on full display in the House chamber last night. Before he got into his accomplishments and moments of across-the-aisle cooperation, the president kicked off the speech with a lighthearted acknowledgement of the state of American politics.
Speaker, I don't want to ruin your reputation, but I look forward to working with you.
But Republicans weren't quite so amused after the president brought up Medicare and Social Security, apparently invoking a proposal from Florida Senator Rick Scott to sunset all federal programs every 5 years unless Congress decides to pass them.
Instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. I'm not saying it's a majority of you. I don't even think it's even a significant, but it's being proposed by individuals. I'm not politely not naming them, but it's being proposed by some of you. So, folks, as we all apparently agree, Social Security and Medicare is off the books now.
Well, joining me now to discuss what we saw last night and what we can expect in the second half of Biden's term is Jennifer Rubin, opinion columnist for the Washington Post covering politics and foreign and domestic policy, and Tammy Vigil, senior associate dean and associate professor of media science at BU's College of Communication. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was certainly an interesting event on the House floor. And I'm going to start with you, Jennifer. You know, Biden was creating a unity message, or at least that's what some of the language or most of the language at the top there was. But then you saw this event on the House floor. What was your takeaway?
Well, I think he's balancing two things, and he did it fairly effectively last night, in part because his delivery was so energetic and he seemed so focused and so up for the event. On one hand, he wants to be seen as reaching out to the other side, and he went back to his, if you recall, unity agenda that he brought up last State of the Union, and says he wants to do more of that sort of thing. And he gave credit to many Republicans who helped out on the infrastructure bill. But he is also willing to draw a line. And we also saw the feisty Biden. And that was when he kind of lured them, I think, into abandoning any hope of cutting Social Security and Medicare, and probably got the better side of things. It never looks good to have people in the audience who want to be thought of as esteemed leaders to be heckling and catcalling. So I think, unfortunately, in this case, Speaker McCarthy failed to get his people to behave as he implored them to do before the speech.
Well, Tammy, do you think that the president was baiting, the hardline right-wingers that were in the audience there? And then what signal does that send to the public when you see this disruption in the House?
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily frame it as baiting. I think that he took an interesting opportunity to call out a point of potential difference. And so that's completely reasonable, well within bounds. The response, though, I think the fact that he went off script to respond to the heckling and to respond to their response was really interesting, completely unexpected, at least from my perspective, because you don't usually see folks go that far off script. Well, except for our previous president, because he had a little trouble staying on script at all. But the idea was that, with Biden, he went off script, he actually engaged, he showed a lot of personality. And even though it might have been, it seemed a little bit less presidential than people might have liked, it really did, I think, speak to the way that a lot of Americans are feeling in terms of the frustration and the wanting to hear somebody respond, to wanting to see someone actually engage in the conversation in a more active kind of way. So I think there were some benefits to him actually engaging in that kind of a manner, even though some people might say it created a little bit more partisanship or a little bit more of a divide. I think it actually gave some voice to what a lot of Americans were feeling.
Jennifer, what else do you think the president got right here?
Well, several things I think struck me about the State of the Union. One was how much time he spent on reciting the economic accomplishments. We know from polling that people don't really recognize the things that he's done, and people still believe we are in a recession, which factually we are not. So I think he understands he's got to do a much better job of reinforcing what he has already done and what it means to ordinary people. And I think we really got a taste of Joe from Scranton, as he likes to say, last night. He not only talked about infrastructure and the CHIPS Act, but he was talking about the smaller things that may seem small, but add up to a great annoyance or expense for middle class and working class people, like airline fees, like banking fees. And I think it was really an exercise in populist economics. Joe Biden is never so strong as when he is defending the little guy against big corporations ripping us off. And I think when he said that he was not going to let big corporations get away with paying no taxes, that didn't go over well with Republicans. But we know from polling, even Republicans out in the country like that idea. So I think in terms of this focus on working class Americans and people who are benefiting, who may not have college educated backgrounds, it was probably a successful outing for him.
Mm. Would you say the same thing, Tammy?
Oh, yes. I think he had a really successful night. I would say the speech was probably about 10 minutes too long, and he and his team need to really work on editing and figuring out, it's a good time to talk about a lot of accomplishments. It's a good time to make a wish list for the future. That's exactly what the speech is supposed to be. But you also have to kind of cull that down and pick the things that you're going to really want to focus in on. So I think his speech had a lot of energy until near the end. He started to lag a little bit, and I thought that was great for people to see. The arguments that he made were a nice combination of generalities and nuance. So he kind of balanced that quite a bit and quite effectively, I thought. And he had a lot of appeals that would cross across party lines for folks who are open-minded enough to actually consider them. Now, we know that people are not necessarily being as open-minded as they could at this juncture in time, primarily the people that were probably in the chamber more so than necessarily the folks out of the chamber. But I think with his energy, his enthusiasm, and the ways in which he constructed his arguments, I thought Joe Biden had a really successful night and did an effective job overall.
Well, we know there weren't any huge sweeping policy announcements that was in the State of the Union. Is that par for the course when you're talking about, the second part of your term? This is just sort of we're staying the course, or should there have been a bigger answer to some of the pain at the pump people are feeling, pain at the grocery store people are feeling, the interest rates for home buyers? Should Biden have had that big punch there, that big policy announcement to meet the public where they are?
I think he passed, and Congress passed under Democrats, an awful lot of legislation. And now the task of the executive branch is to execute, is to make sure that these things go well, that they're visible in people's lives. And so he's going to spend a lot of time on the execution side of things. And you're right, he's not going to be able to get these mammoth package deals through. But he did come up with a number of more narrowly tailored proposals that might have a chance. That's what the unity agenda is about. That's what his plea for a better policing of the internet, which is a very popular thing to say these days. So he didn't completely neglect new ideas, but they were much more narrowly tailored. And I think that's appropriate both politically as well as really economically, as we kind of see how these things work out. I don't know that the Federal Reserve would be much enamored of spending another $1 trillion on something. He's trying to build up confidence that we're reducing the debt, we're reducing inflation. So I think he wants to implement what he's already passed, and I think he wants to show that there are ideas that may not cost a lot of money, but that are really popular and make a difference in people's lives.
Well, Tammy, let me ask you this, because as we talk about, what Jennifer's point about the spending that we've been doing, China and the war in Ukraine, of about the 7,000 words that I was able to decipher, only about 200 words were spent on China and Ukraine, when we've spent, trillions of dollars there, a lot of money. And of course, China in the news with the balloon that we recently had to shoot down. Do you think the president spent enough time talking about those things?
Yes, I think he did. I think the problem was he needed to trim in other places, and then that would have felt a lot more balanced if he hadn't spent so much time on other things. The reason why I think he did spend enough time in this particular speech on those issues is because his real focus was talking about the domestic policies and the domestic affairs that in terms of his successes, in terms of his plan moving forward. And to your earlier question, the idea of meeting people where they live, the domestic issues are the ones that I think he was going to get a little bit more bang for his buck. And there was more of a possibility that he could build some type of bipartisan support for. And so might be able to be a little bit more effective. So while I think those are important, the balloon, China, Ukraine, all of that is super important holistically within what's going on in the U.S., I think he still needed to focus a little bit more on the things that he did focus on, the more domestically oriented things, so that folks are not so, well, they're all going to be upset about the price of eggs. That's what everybody's talking about. And so he has to deal with those kinds of issues instead of, being then criticized for looking outside when he should be trying to keep house a little bit better. So I think he did balance that out effectively.
Yeah, a couple of moments that struck me was, of course, the presence of Tyre Nichols' mother, and the gentleman Brendan say that disarmed the mass shooter in Monterey, California, and in talking about guns and in talking about crime and police and things like that. I think about those two images. Do you think that evoked enough emotion where there will be more bipartisan support for this legislation around gun control, mass shootings, and things like this? And then this conversation that's such a hot button issue when we're talking about police and law enforcement reform and implicit bias and things like this.
He did something very interesting in very divided government on very hot button issues. I don't think it would have done him very much good to list 24, 25, or a dozen proposals for dealing with crime or dealing with policing. And so he took a more empathetic, more emotional approach in which he kind of reached out and he took the audience on a bit of a journey, asking them to put themselves in the shoes, for example, of Tyre Nichols' parents and other African-American parents who have to have the talk with their children. So I think he chose empathy and a sense of unifying mission rather than listing off a whole list of laundry items that he hopes to achieve. If we are going to achieve anything in these areas, it's certainly not going to be straight from the White House. It'll be a matter of some backroom negotiation. So I think it was an effective part. And again, when you talk about Biden, quintessentially emotional, empathetic, painting a picture for the audience that he is not only, I think, calling us to the better angels of our nature, but also, I think, making a more philosophical argument that these things should be basic human concerns, not partisan issues. So I actually liked that part of the speech. It was interesting, and it was a creative way of not having to go forward with a lot of detailed proposals.
And if I could just jump in for a second, I think I agree with everything that she said, but I also want to say that I don't think that part was necessarily going to be about future legislation, no matter what, because the legislation arguments are going to happen in different kinds of places. But I think what that was a strategic moment to talk to the viewers across America and to get them to have conversations that would then possibly sort of, rise up, create some great grassroots conversations so that those folks would put pressure on their legislators. Because I think a lot of the folks who were in the chamber, a lot of the people who've already been elected to office have sort of set some entrenched perspectives on those issues. And so this was a way of kind of going around them and circumventing them to get to talk to the constituents.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Jennifer Rubin and Jennifer Rubin and Tammy Vigil. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Next up, among a number of successes President Biden pointed to in his State of the Union was the bipartisan gun reform package that he signed into law last summer, which includes enhanced background checks and emergency confiscation for people deemed to be a danger to themselves or others. But the president acknowledged there is still a lot more to do to keep Americans safe from gun violence. Barely into its second month, 2023 has already seen more than 50 mass shootings. The deadliest was on January 21st in Monterey Park, California, where a gunman opened fire during a Lunar New Year's celebration, killing 11 people and hurting at least 9 others before he was disarmed by one of the attendees. That was 26-year-old Brandon Say, who Biden honored last night.
He saved lives. It's time we do the same. Ban assault weapons now. Ban them now. Once and for all.
It's a goal the president pledged to achieve back on the campaign trail in 2020. What are the chances that he'll be able to make good on his promise? To discuss, I'm joined by Tony Montalto, whose daughter Gina was shot and killed in the 2018 shooting at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and who now leads this group, Stand with Parkland. Tony, thank you so much for taking the time with us.
Thank you for having me today.
So in listening to the State of the Union address, what stood out to you? Did it feel like the president was making good on these promises?
Well, I think there's many things to do. As you know, Stand with Parkland has worked to make our schools safer for our teachers and our students, using our school safety triad of securing the campus, better mental health screening and support programs, and finally, responsible firearms ownership. So we believe that the president is trying a multitude of things. We're happy to have seen some bipartisan support this past summer, creating the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which addressed all 3 parts of our school safety triad. And additionally, as a follow-up, shortly after that bill passed, the Senate also came together in a bipartisan fashion to finally get an ATF director in place for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
I know that police reform, crime, things like this were part of President Biden's address. But do you think now that we are in 2023, just barely a couple of months into it, we've had more mass shootings than days that we've been into 2023. How does that make you feel as someone who's been doing this work for years now?
Well, it's certainly saddening, especially for our families, because we know the pain that each victim's family feels when their loved ones are taken from them in these random and violent acts. We also know that the solution is not one-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional. That's why we work with the U.S. Secret Service and the National Threat Assessment Center to allow them to go out and train people on how to do a proper behavioral threat assessment so that people that are exhibiting troubling behaviors can have an intervention and get the help they need before they resort to violence. Firearms and access to firearms is certainly part of the problem, but it is not the end all and be all. We need everyone to look out for one another. We need our law enforcement folks to be able to investigate things when things are brought to them. And we need people to look for people that are having difficulties and try and get them the help they need. One of the things we work with is the Columbia Protocol, which is available on our website at standwithparkland.org under our resources page. And this is a suicide prevention tool that anybody can use. It's an app on your phone now, and it gives you the opportunity to interact with somebody you see who's having a difficult time. And it's that coming together, that kindness and that compassion that is definitely part of this solution.
Well, speaking of that, the coming together, you mentioned the bipartisan support, and of course we saw, standing ovations when the gentleman who disarmed the shooter in Monterey Park was acknowledged there. Do you believe, and the same token, we saw a lot of divisiveness on the floor there. Do you think that there is going to be a bipartisan push that will be effective in the last part of the president's, presidency here?
I think the only way to help solve these issues and make our community safer is by working together in a bipartisan fashion. Neither party has all the answers by themselves, and each party will need to compromise in order to achieve some goals. One of the things that Stand with Parkland is focused on is the art of the possible, the act of getting things and bringing people together to make us all a little bit safer. We can't just hold out to wait for the home run to bring it in. Sadly, there's no magic wand. It's more of building a bridge. It's more of realizing that we just need to work together to find solutions. And part of finding solutions is understanding that no is not an acceptable answer. People need to address their concerns. We need to listen, but then we need to find a compromise position. And we need to bring that forward to our policymakers and our lawmakers in order to make all of our communities safer, and especially when it comes to the safety of our children and teachers at school.
Well, Tony, there weren't any huge, policy announcements, any sort of ground shifting things that were in this State of the Union address. Are you confident that we're going to be able to make this big shift in the access to guns, as you mentioned, in the mental health piece, as you mentioned, in preventing this mass shooting number to rise? Are you confident that we're going to be able to make this type of change moving forward, given what you heard last night in the president's speech?
Well, what I heard is him trying to bring people together to solve the problem. And I think that's, again, one of the most important parts, is having fulsome discussions and debates, and then finding a position that we can move forward on. Doing nothing is not an acceptable answer. That's why Stand with Parkland formed, because the tragedy that took the life of my beautiful daughter, Gina, her 13 classmates and her 3 teachers, was caused by a broken status quo. And we've been trying to change that. We've been successful somewhat in Washington. We've seen some movement. We've worked with good people on both sides of the aisle. We were able to work with the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And again, it's just the idea of coming together and everybody giving a little to realize that this isn't a debate about firearms only. This is a public safety issue, and we have to focus on the safety of our public.
Tony, moving forward as we go into if you're going to look forward to 2024, right, and the next State of the Union address, and of course, in a few years we have another election cycle. What do you want to have changed on this landscape?
Well, I think there's a multitude of issues. I think one bill in particular that had bipartisan support in the last Congress and is going to be introduced again in this 118th Congress is the Eagles Act. The Eagles Act is named after the mascot of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and that will provide the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center additional funding and reauthorization to allow them to go out in our communities to train our school professionals, our mental health professionals, and our law enforcement folks on how to work together to form a multidisciplinary team and investigate people that are exhibiting troubling behaviors. We also need to make sure that the financial support put forth in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is initiated and is rolled out in a proper fashion, both for the mental health components as well as for the firearms pieces. We need to make sure that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is following up on those enhanced background checks that were put in place for purchasers under the age of 21. We need to make sure that we are closing the so-called boyfriend loophole. We need to make sure that we're preventing the straw man purchases. All of this was passed into law. All of it was funded. Now we have to implement it, and it's very important to follow through on that implementation.
All right, Tony Montalto, I know that you are in between flights, which is why we're hearing some of the noise in the background. Again, thank you so much for your time and the work that you're doing with Stand with Parkland.
Well, thanks for having me and helping us get the word out. Again, look at standwithparkland.org, and the resources page is a multitude of things that can help make our communities grow.
That's it for tonight. I'm Crystal Haynes. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Well, you have been responding to our call for questions in recent weeks, so we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can in short order. Laura Bennett from Westport asks, why is there a particular kind of rock in Massachusetts known as pudding stone? Well, pudding stone is a type of sedimentary rock known as a conglomerate, which means there's a bunch of different gravel-sized kind of stones in there which are stuck together with sediment. It's like a mishmash. Now, when European settlers first came here, they saw this rock and it reminded them of their favorite dessert from home, fruit pudding. Now, of course, English pudding is different than American pudding. If you've ever seen the Great British Baking Show, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and the fact that a lot of British desserts kind of look like rocks. Local tip: if you want to see a really weird poem about pudding stone, head to Fitzgerald Park in Mission Hill in Boston. Alice Fastov from Dedham, Massachusetts wants to know, what is the difference between spider webs and cobwebs? Well, there are some spiders, like, say, a black widow, that make these dimensional, irregular webs, and those are known as cobwebs. But in general, a cobweb simply refers to a spider web that has been abandoned. Now, that cob in cobweb comes from an old Middle English word, cop, which just means spider. Susan from Boston asks, why do wheels on cars in TV commercials seem to be spinning backwards? Well, Susan, what's happening with the camera is it's actually taking just a bunch of pictures, and then your brain is assembling those pictures to say, I see motion. Now, when the speed is just right, here's what's going on. You got a car wheel. Let's say there's a spot you're noticing on that car wheel right there at 12 o'clock. The next picture in the camera, that spot is maybe at 11 o'clock. The next picture in the camera, that spot is maybe at 10 o'clock. So what your brain is interpreting is that the wheel is actually moving backwards. Incidentally, the same thing can happen just in person. Your eye and your brain kind of work the same way as the camera, not exactly, but if the speed is right, you'll notice it right there in front of you. Well, that's all we have time for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and perhaps most importantly, let me know what you are curious about, because hey, I might just look into it for you. I'm Edgar B. Herwick III. Stay curious out there.
The Curiosity Desk is sponsored by Emerson College, inspiring curiosity and creative expression in all of us.